I spend a good amount of my free time looking for the best and most exciting mods to put in my video game consoles. I tend to focus specifically on two different types of mods that will either make the console's video output better, or mods that will make it easy for me to play my games without needing the original physical media. When it comes to the GameCube, the GC Dual and the GC Loader, both from Black Dog Tech, were the best mods in both of those categories. The GC Dual is an internal HDMI mod for the GameCube that allows me to play my GameCube on a modern TV or monitor without needing an external adapter or scaler. But this video isn't about the GC Dual. The GC Loader is an ODE or optical drive emulator for the GameCube. Using an app called Swiss, GC Loader can allow me to load and play games using an SD card. The GC Loader was an amazing mod when it came out, but more recently, WebHDX has developed a mod called PicoBoot, which may be the new best mod in the play games without needing the original media category. PicoBoot also uses Swiss to play games from an SD card, but PicoBoot is made from a $4 Raspberry Pi Pico. By contrast, the GC Loader cost $90 when it was released. I'll go into more of the differences between the two mods, but for now, I've been dying to install PicoBoot in one of my GameCubes. Let's jump over to the bench and I'll show you how. First things first, let's go over all the parts that we're gonna need. Obviously, we're gonna need one of these Raspberry Pi Picos. This is where the PicoBoot firmware is gonna run from. But to make mounting the Raspberry Pi Pico a little bit easier, I'm gonna cheat a little bit and I'm gonna use this fan mount from LaserBear. This fan mount was designed to hold this upgraded fan known as the noise blocker, but if you look on the right side here, there is a mount that will hold the Raspberry Pi Pico in place. If you don't want to buy one of these fan mounts, I'll show you other places where you can mount the Raspberry Pi Pico. We're also going to need some wires to solder this Raspberry Pi Pico to the GameCube itself. WebHDX recommends to use thicker wires for both the voltage and ground for this mod, so I'm actually going to use this 26 gauge silicone wire for all 5 of the connections that we're going to have to solder. I've got 5 different colored wires here, which is awesome because that's the same amount of wires that we're going to need to solder to the Pico. And the last thing that you'll need is either an SD to SP2 or an SD Gecko, which are basically SD card adapters, which will allow you to boot into Swiss and load your games. You only need one or the other of these, so you can choose whether you want the SD card in the front where the memory card slots are, or underneath where the serial port 2 is. And I've got this 32 gigabyte Samsung SD card. I'm going to be doing this install in a DOL001 GameCube. You can check that by looking at this number at the bottom of the GameCube. Another weird thing that you might want to check is to see if your console actually has a serial port 2 port. I've seen some pictures of DOL001 consoles that actually don't have this connector soldered in here, but you're definitely going to need that in order to connect your SD to SP2 if that's what you choose. All right, we've got all our parts. Let's go ahead and open the case of our GameCube. In the corners in the bottom here, there are 4 game bit screws. Let's go ahead and remove those. Then if we flip the console over, we can remove the top shell. Let's take off the controller port board from the front here by pulling up on these tabs on either side and then removing the ribbon cable underneath here. And then we can do the same thing for this panel in the back. You can see pretty much all the way around the console, there are sets of screws on each side. Starting in the front here, let's remove all the screws. For the front, you can remove these little metal pieces too. In order to get at this screw and some of the other screws on this side with the fan, we've got to remove this fan shroud. First, we need to disconnect this red and black cable here and kind of untangle it. Then we can remove the screws for the fan shroud. And then we can lift this off. Now we can finish unscrewing the rest of the screws. After all that, we should be able to carefully remove the disk drive in all one big piece. The final bit of disassembly that we're gonna have to do is to remove this heatsink here. You can see that there are 6 screws in the top here, so let's go ahead and unscrew them. I have a feeling that this heatsink is not going to come off very easily because it's pretty cold. It was actually sitting in front of my air conditioner before I filmed this part. What I'd like to do is use my hot air rework station on a pretty low setting to try to heat up this heatsink. Okay, I wouldn't say that's really hot to the touch or anything, but it's definitely not cold, which it was before. So let's go ahead and try to wiggle this thing back and forth. Okay, come on, this is ridiculous. All right, well, it looks like I did what Macho Nacho did and pretty much botched some of these pads. I think he said that these bigger ones are 2 millimeters and the smaller ones are 1 millimeter. So I'm gonna go ahead and order a set of both of those so when I put this back together, I can have nice fresh pads. But while I'm here, I'm gonna go ahead and clean up this pad so that when the new pads come, I can just stick them on. I've got a little bit of isopropyl alcohol that I can use to clean up this residue. Okay, yeah, maybe don't wiggle this heatsink to get it off. If you look pretty closely, you can see that there are these etchings here where the different chips on the board are. I think there's a risk that you might scratch any of these heat spreaders here as you try to wiggle the heatsink off. So I guess what I'm trying to say is prying is probably better than wiggling. Actually, I just looked at the pad thicknesses. We're gonna need a 2 millimeter pad for this chip, a 1.5 millimeter pad for this chip, and 1 millimeter pads for the memory chips. Now we're gonna have to solder those 5 wires to both the board and this IPL chip. I'm gonna be following WebHDX's wiring diagram, and there's actually 2 different diagrams. One if you have a DOL001 console, and one if you have a DOL101 console. Mine is a DOL001 console, so if that's what you've got too, you can follow along with what I'm doing. I'm gonna grab about 8 inches or so of our 5 different silicone wire colors and put this aside. I'm gonna start soldering in this section down here in yellow where there are a bunch of pins, and then we can tin the pins in this area according to our diagram. So there are these 2 pins here for ground. There's this pin down here for GP5, and then this pin over here for 3 volts. Starting with our black wire, I'm gonna go ahead and strip and tin one of the ends. I'm actually gonna strip a little bit longer than I normally would because we have to bridge 2 of the pins down here. Okay, after our wire is tinned, I'm gonna go ahead and turn up my soldering iron a little bit. This ground pin right here is actually pretty hard to solder. It actually takes a lot of heat. So I'm gonna go ahead and turn up my soldering iron a little bit. Then we can add some liquid flux, and then we can bridge those 2 ground pins together. If you need to add a little bit more solder, you could do that. Okay, next we've got our GP5 pin. I actually don't have a pink wire like it has in the diagram. I'm gonna use my green wire instead. So go ahead and strip and tin one end of the green wire. We actually don't need to strip it any longer like we did this one. We can strip this one normally. All right, let's add some more liquid flux and solder our green wire to the GP5 pin. All right, next we can move on to the red wire, strip and tin this, and then we can solder it to the 3 volt pin. All right, with those 3 wires out of the way, let's go ahead and move up to the IPL chip up here. We can start by tinning the legs that we need to solder to. So the 2nd pin on the left on the bottom row, and the 3rd pin from the left on the top row. The yellow wire is first, go ahead and strip and tin that. Okay, then we can turn the GameCube just a little bit here, add some more liquid flux, and solder the yellow wire to the pin on the left. All right, then we can rotate it the opposite way, and then we can strip and tin the blue wire. And now we're gonna solder this blue wire coming off of the opposite side of the IPL chip, because once we put this heatsink back on, it's going to be in the way. Basically, the wire is gonna get squished on top of the IPL chip. Okay, then I'm gonna bend this wire sort of at an angle here. Then I'm gonna hold it in place over the pin I wanna solder to, add some more liquid flux, and then solder it to the pin. There's our 5 wires soldered. I'm gonna go ahead and clean up everything with some isopropyl alcohol. Okay, I know this is gonna be kind of hard to show off, but here is all 5 of my wires. So it's actually been a few days and I've received the thermal pads that I can use to replace the ones that I ruined in the beginning. So I'm gonna need a 1 millimeter one, a 1.5 millimeter one, and this 2 millimeter thick one. So I'm gonna cut out a 2 millimeter square to fit on this chip over here. All right, then I'm gonna remove the plastic on one of the sides and stick it down on this chip. And then I'm gonna remove the plastic on the other side. So now I'm gonna do the same thing for this big chip here, and this one is gonna be 1.5 millimeters. And finally, I'm gonna make pads out of this 1 millimeter thick pad for these two memory chips over here. Okay, before I secure the heatsink, I'd like to put some of this Kapton tape over these wires over here to kind of hold them down. I've seen in a couple of other videos that they use a bit of heat shrink tube so that the metal edge of the CD-ROM drive doesn't cut any of these wires here. But these wires are a little bit too thick for any of the heat shrink tube that I have. So I think if I put a little bit of Kapton tape here just to kind of hold them in place, that should be good enough for keeping these wires out of the way when the shield is down. So I've got a piece of tape. I'm gonna go ahead and flatten these wires out, put them in the corner down here, and then place this tape kind of over them here. All right, let's put the heatsink back, and keep in mind that this is directional, so just look for the etchings on the bottom of the heatsink and just sort of put it on those pads in the right spot, and we can carefully secure it with the screws. I'm gonna put all the screws on kind of half tight so that I apply pretty even pressure to those pads underneath, and then I can fully secure them down. All right, now we can grab our disk drive and put it over the top of everything. Remember to push down the CD drive into the slot there. And I know this doesn't look the best, but I think this should be okay once we solder these wires up to the Pico. Now I'm gonna go ahead and put all the screws back around the GameCube, with the exception of these two on the end with the side with this power cable here. This is where the fan is gonna have to get installed. And don't forget these little metal pieces that go in the front by the memory card slots. With most of the screws installed, let's go ahead and put this GameCube part aside, and let's take a look at the Laser Bear fan mount. If you look at this right side here, this is where the Raspberry Pi Pico is going to fit in once it's soldered up. But if you take a look at the original fan mount, there is pretty much the same situation going on here. So if you really wanted to, you don't have to buy the Laser Bear fan mount, and you can double-sided tape your Raspberry Pi Pico sort of in the same spot with the original fan mount. But the other thing you'll notice is this power button PCB here. So let's go ahead and unscrew the power button PCB from the original fan mount. Disconnect that. Unscrew this screw from the Laser Bear mount. Put the power button PCB in place, and we can screw the power button PCB to the new fan mount. Now we need to put our new noise blocker fan into the mount. I believe the fan in the original mount is supposed to be an exhaust, so we're gonna do pretty much the same thing with the Laser Bear mount. And I think the intended orientation is so that the wires here are coming off this right side. There is this little slot in the fan mount. I think that's where the fan wire is gonna go through. So go ahead and sneak this wire through the side of the fan mount and very carefully slide the fan in place. Something like that. When all's said and done, you should see these braces here on the fan should kind of match the original fan orientation. And you can see this cool Laser Bear fan sticker. With the noise blocker fan installed, go ahead and bring the GameCube back in. We can sort of put it in place on the side here. And using the remaining two screws, go ahead and secure the new fan mount. Let's go ahead and feed this power cable into the notch on the side of the fan shroud. And then we can plug in the power cable as well as the fan into that power board. And with the GameCube mostly reassembled, let's go ahead and hop over to the computer and install the PicoBoot firmware onto this Raspberry Pi Pico. Here we are over on the PicoBoot installation guide. Let's scroll down to the flashing Raspberry Pi Pico board section. We're gonna click on the Get the Latest Release page, scroll down to Assets, and click on this PicoBoot.uf2. Now we need to use a micro USB cable to plug the Raspberry Pi Pico in, but before we do that, we're gonna press the Boot Select button. If everything is going well, then you're gonna have this File Explorer open up. We just need to drag and drop the PicoBoot.uf2 into that File Explorer that opened. Then the Raspberry Pi Pico will reboot, and after that, it's all flashed. With our Raspberry Pi Pico flashed, now we have to tackle the challenge of soldering our wires to it. One thing I noticed is this fan wire is kind of in the way at the moment. It shouldn't be once everything is all said and done, but I'm just gonna unplug it quickly first, just so that it's out of the way. Now I know we wanna keep the wires as short as possible here, but I still want to be able to take the Raspberry Pi Pico out and put it back in to our mount here without unsoldering anything. So what I'm gonna do is place the Raspberry Pi Pico like this. The USB port is going to be sticking out of the top of our mount when we're all said and done. So I'm just kind of mirror that here on the table. I'm gonna start with the wire that is closest to the GameCube as we're soldering, and that is going to be this yellow wire that we're going to solder to GP6 and 7 on the Pico. If you flip the Pico over, you can actually see all of the pinouts, so you can refer to the back here if you need to know which pin is which. Let's just do a dry fit, kind of putting the yellow wire down, kind of simulating how we might mount it to the board here. Let's see if we kind of grab the Pico and the wire together. Is this going to reach? Yeah, it should. So what I'm gonna do is put the Raspberry Pi Pico maybe about a centimeter or so away from the edge of the GameCube. Mark with my finger where the wire needs to be cut, and then place the wire here, maybe leaving a little bit of extra slack, and then cut that wire. Now I'm gonna try to solder these wires through the pins here and not just solder them to the face of the pins. And since this yellow wire is going to need to be bridged to 2 different pins, I'm gonna go ahead and strip some of it. Mine's probably about a centimeter, maybe a little bit less. And then we're gonna tin this wire. Now I'm going to put the wire through the GP7 hole and solder it in place on GP7. And since we need to bridge it over to GP6, I'm just going to fold the wire over and solder to GP6 as well. If we have any extra wire, we can go ahead and cut it off. I've got a little bit. Let's do a test here to see if it's going to actually fit. Now, if anything, I think we have a little bit of extra length, but I think that should be okay for now. Now, I'm basically gonna rinse and repeat this same process for all the other wires, except for all the other wires don't need to be bridged at all. So basically you can just cut them, tin them, and then solder them to the back of the Pico here. So next I'm gonna do the ground. I'm gonna put the Pico in place here, take this ground cable and kind of give it the same length as the yellow wire, and then cut it to the length of this ground pad here. Then we can strip it and tin it, and we can solder it to the back of the Pico. And if you need to test in between each wire, you can go ahead and do that to see if the length is correct. And then I'm gonna do the same thing for all the other wires following the diagram on the PicoBoot instructions. And here is a close-up of where I soldered all my wires to. And with all the soldering done, let's go ahead and put the Raspberry Pi Pico into the fan mount. Going to press it firmly into the holes. Goes in pretty easily. And then we're going to put back our fan cable. Then we can pretty much put the GameCube back together in the reverse order that we took it apart. Just be mindful of these cables sticking out of here when we go and put the top of the case back on. We're back on the installation guide. Now let's scroll down to the preparing SD card section. We're gonna click here to go to the Swiss release page. We're gonna go down to the bottom of the assets and click this Swiss zip file. Then we can go ahead and plug in our SD card. And we wanna make sure that the SD card is formatted as FAT32. In my case, it already is, but if you needed to, you could right click and click format here and format as FAT32. Okay, now we can move the Swiss zip file into that folder. And with the zip file in our SD card here, we can go ahead and open it up. And then I'm gonna navigate into this folder, into the DOL folder, and then I'm going to click and drag this Swiss release and then the release version .dol into the base folder of our SD card. You can delete the zip file if you want to now we're all done with it. Now we're going to need to rename this swiss.dol to ipl.dol. This is how the PicoBoot is going to load Swiss. So it's going to look for this ipl.dol inside of our SD card, and that's how it's going to boot into Swiss. And the last thing we need is some actual games so that we can test it out. So I'm going to drag some games over, and with our games moved over, we can finally use Swiss and test our PicoBoot installation. To actually do that, we need to take our SD card that we installed Swiss onto and connect it to our PicoBoot modded GameCube. For this console, I'm going to use this SD Gecko, mostly because I'm interested to see what the performance is going to be like. I think a lot of people are going to choose to use the SD to SP2 instead, but we'll talk about that a little bit later, why I don't think that this is that great of an option. So with the SD card mounted into our SD Gecko, just go ahead and place it into one of the memory card slots. For the most part, I don't think it matters which slot you plug it into, but since my memory card is always in slot A, I'm gonna put the SD Gecko in slot B. Now we can just plug the power and the video cable in, and let's turn the sucker on. If you want to use the SD to SP2 instead, just take your micro SD card, plug it into the SD to SP2 adapter, flip the console over, and then we need to plug the SD to SP2 in. The memory card is going to be facing toward the inside of the GameCube. Then you can put this cover back on if you want. And then you can start the console just like the SD Gecko. If you've installed your PicoBoot correctly and you have Swiss on your SD card, then you'll be greeted immediately by Swiss. I'm not going to go into too much detail about how to use Swiss. I'm sure there's 1,000 other YouTube videos about that. The only thing that we're really concerned with is how do we load games from here. All we have to do is use the D-pad on our GameCube controller to select the games folder that I created, and inside of there are all the games that I have. To load a game, all you have to do is navigate down with the D-pad to a game and press A. Pressing A again will boot the game. Now that we've seen how easy it is to use Swiss on the PicoBoot, let's talk a little bit about the GC loader. It's actually just as easy to use Swiss on the GC loader as it is to use it on the PicoBoot, but instead of naming that Swiss.dol to IPL.dol, you just name it boot.dol, and then you can load games on your SD card, insert it into the GC loader, and you can start and boot into Swiss just the same. So then what are the differences between the GC loader and the PicoBoot? Well, for one thing, the GC loader is a solderless mod, meaning that you don't need to solder anything to get it to work. The GC loader mod board itself has the same connector as the GameCube's disk drive does, so all you have to do is unscrew the disk drive from that metal shield inside the GameCube, attach the GC loader, and just connect it to where the GameCube disk drive was. So that makes the GC loader a lot easier to install inside of a GameCube for people who are not really comfortable with soldering, or maybe you don't even have any of the soldering equipment yet. That effectively makes the GC loader less expensive even than the PicoBoot mod if you need to buy a soldering iron and all the other equipment. Also, because the GC loader completely replaces the GameCube stock disk drive, this has a couple of added benefits. For one, if you have a completely damaged GameCube disk drive, maybe it's preventing the GameCube from booting, replacing it with the GC loader can actually get that GameCube to work again. This also provides a convenient SD card location since you won't have to take up one of your memory card slots or the SP2 port. And it's easy to update the GC loader's firmware by uploading firmware files directly to the SD card. You don't need to completely disassemble your GameCube to update the GC loader's firmware. So then what are some of the downsides to the GC loader? Well, in my opinion, the biggest downside is how expensive it is at $90, not including shipping. For the most part, you probably won't even be able to buy one right now. They've been out of stock for at least a few months now. And because the project is not open source, that means that other manufacturers can't step in and help with the manufacturing. And lastly, unless you want a gaping hole in the top of your GameCube where the disk drive was, you're probably going to want to pick up one of LaserBear's GC loader SD card mounts, which will fill the hole that the GameCube disk drive occupied, as well as add an SD card extension to even more easily plug in your SD card. So does that mean in 2022 the PicoBoot is a better mod than the GC loader? Well, if you already have all the soldering equipment, you'll only need a few inexpensive pieces to get the PicoBoot working. You'll need the Raspberry Pi Pico, the wiring, the Kapton tape, and either an SD Gecko or an SD to SP2 adapter. All those pieces together are still less expensive than the GC loader. Another benefit is it's pretty good soldering practice. If you're somebody who is learning how to solder and you want to get some more good practice with wires, soldering to chips, the PicoBoot is an awesome opportunity for that. And all those pieces are pretty readily available. The Raspberry Pi Pico has been in stock for a while, wiring is always in stock, and the SD to SP2 and SD Gecko are pretty much available all the time. And the firmware is open source, meaning that if something ever happened to WebHDX, knock on wood, somebody else might be able to pick up the project and continue supporting it. Well, there can't be only good things about the PicoBoot, so what are the problems with it? Well, first of all, you need to be able to solder the wires, and that right there might be enough of a barrier to have some people not be able to install on their own GameCubes. Also, if you chose to use the SD to SP2 adapter, that gets blocked by the Game Boy player. So if you want to use both the SD to SP2 adapter with your PicoBoot as well as the Game Boy player, you better have a flathead screwdriver on hand at all times to be able to unscrew that Game Boy player to get at your SD card. But that doesn't really make the SD Gecko a better option either, because it completely blocks one of your memory card slots. And lastly, you'll need to disassemble your GameCube anytime that you want to update the PicoBoot firmware. That's not the same as updating Swiss. All you'd have to do there is download the newest version of Swiss, put that on your SD card, and change it to IPL.dol. But if there's ever a feature update to the PicoBoot firmware itself, you'll have to crack open your GameCube again. If this video helped you understand the differences between the GC loader and the PicoBoot, give this video a like, and get subscribed so you don't miss any of my console modding tutorials. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.